the woman who birthed death itself. That's what the people of Harlan County, Kentucky ended up calling her. And before this story reaches its conclusion, you'll come to understand exactly why the title wasn't some dramatic exaggeration, but rather a heartbreakingly accurate description of a woman whose physical form became a grave for every child she delivered into existence. Spring 1931 found the misty hollow of southeastern Kentucky, places where the Appalachian Mountains fold into themselves like secrets passed down through generations. There existed in that forgotten corner a settlement most maps simply omitted. Creek Hollow, the locals called it, a valley so tightly tucked away that 17 miles of treacherous dirt path separated it from the nearest paved road. During spring rains and winter freezes, that path became utterly impassable, sealing the hollow off from the outside world entirely. Here, in this place of isolation, the Combs family had made their home for more than a century and a half. Generation stacked upon generation in weathered wooden cabins that clung to the mountainside like desperate fingers gripping a cliff's edge. Ezekiel Combs, born in 1847, ruled as patriarch over this secluded clan. He'd survived the Civil War by staying hidden in these same mountains, watching from above as both Confederate and Union soldiers marched through the valleys below. In 1869, Ezekiel took his first cousin Prudence as his wife, continuing a pattern his own father and grandfather had established long before him. Inside Creek Hollow's isolation, where contact with anyone beyond the ridge was measured in months rather than days, marrying within the family raised no eyebrows. It was simply what had to be done. But Ezekiel couldn't have known, and the science of his era couldn't have explained, that each successive generation of closely related unions was slowly poisoning the Combs bloodline drop by drop. By 1931, the results of this genetic isolation had become impossible to overlook. Mabel Combs entered the world in 1895, born to parents who themselves emerged from 3 generations of cousin marriages. From her very first breath, Mabel stood apart. Her left leg fell several inches short of her right, forcing her into a pronounced limp that would define every step she ever took. Her fingers emerged fused at the base, a condition that had appeared before in earlier generations but had always been chalked up to divine purpose rather than biological reality. But Mabel's face drew the most attention. Her jaw had developed so poorly that her lower teeth jutted forward at an unnatural angle. Her pale gray eyes, the color of morning fog rolling over the mountains, sat too widely spaced, creating an expression that unsettled anyone who looked at her. Valley people, on those rare occasions when Mabel made the trip to the trading post in Harlan, would cross to the opposite side of the muddy street just to avoid her. Yet behind those unusual eyes burned a sharp intelligence. From a tattered Bible, the only book the Combs household possessed, Mabel taught herself to read. She absorbed passages and recited them during those long winter nights when the family pressed together around the fireplace, their only defense against the cold that seeped through the drafty cabin walls. In 1913, Mabel turned 18. Her father announced she would wed her uncle Jeremiah Combs, a man 23 years her senior. Jeremiah was her father's younger brother, which made him both her uncle and, after the ceremony, her husband. This arrangement wasn't born of cruelty but from the twisted reasoning that had guided the Combs family across generations. The hollow contained no other suitable men, and the family couldn't afford to lose a worker to marriage outside their isolated community. Mabel had no voice in the matter. In the patriarchal structure of Appalachian Mountain society in 1913, a woman's consent simply wasn't required or even considered. An itinerant preacher who passed through the hollow once annually conducted a small ceremony, asking no uncomfortable questions about the relationships binding bride and groom. 1914 brought the first child, a boy Mabel named Samuel. He arrived with a cleft palate so severe that feeding became nearly impossible. For 3 weeks, his hunger cries echoed through the hollow before pneumonia and starvation finally claimed his tiny life. They buried him on the hillside behind the cabin beneath a roughly carved wooden cross. 1916 brought another child, a girl this time. She emerged without a skull cap, her brain exposed to the mountain air. 6 hours she lived, and her mother held her every moment, watching as life slowly drained from that deformed little body. They laid her next to her brother. By 1931, Mabel had given birth 14 times. Only 3 of those children survived past their first year. The hillside behind the cabin had transformed into a cemetery. 11 small graves lined up in rows, 11 wooden crosses weathered by mountain rain and mountain wind. The 3 surviving children, Elias, Ruth, and Martha, all carried the visible marks of their parents' shared blood. Elias, born in 1920, possessed severe intellectual limitations that left him able to speak only a few words. He communicated through grunts and gestures, his eyes vacant yet somehow aware. Ruth, born in 1923, came into the world deaf and with a curved spine that would worsen with every passing year. Martha, the youngest survivor born in 1927, appeared the most normal of the 3, but her heartbeat followed an irregular rhythm the local midwife had never encountered before. But Mabel herself had undergone the most disturbing transformation. With each pregnancy, each birth, each tiny coffin lowered into mountain soil, something inside her had begun to decay. Not merely her spirit, but her actual physical body. 1925 brought the first sign after her 10th pregnancy. A patch of skin on her left arm turned gray and refused to heal from a small cut she'd gotten working in the garden. The wound festered, not with normal infection, but with something else entirely. The surrounding flesh seemed to die, turning dark and leathery like dried apple skin. By 1928, the condition had spread. Patches of dead tissue now covered both arms and had started appearing on her torso. Granny Hoskins, the elderly midwife who had delivered babies in these mountains for 60 years, had witnessed nothing like it. "It's like her body's dying while she's still living," Granny Hoskins whispered to Mabel's husband after examining her in spring 1929. "Like the life's just draining out of her piece by piece." The medical term for what afflicted Mabel. Had anyone in Creek Hollow known, they might have called it a severe form of peripheral arterial disease combined with autoimmune complications. Modern science has since linked these conditions to the genetic abnormalities caused by generations of inbreeding. But in 1931, in an isolated Kentucky hollow, there existed no diagnosis, no treatment, no explanation. Only the slow, horrifying deterioration of a woman's body. And still Mabel kept becoming pregnant. Her husband Jeremiah, acting on the only understanding of marital duty he'd ever known, continued fulfilling what he believed obligation demanded, and Mabel's body, despite its decay, kept producing children. Late summer 1931 brought something to Creek Hollow that would finally shatter the Combs family's isolation. A young social worker from the newly formed Kentucky Department of Welfare had been assigned to survey Harlan County's remote communities, documenting living conditions and identifying families needing government assistance during the Great Depression's depths. Eleanor Whitfield, a Berea College graduate with idealistic notions about helping her home state's mountain people, had grown up in comfortable Lexington with no real understanding of what true isolation meant in the Appalachian hollows. When Eleanor finally reached Creek Hollow in September 1931, guided by a reluctant local who refused to take her within a mile of the Combs property, nothing could have prepared her for what awaited. The smell hit her first. Even from 100 yards away, an odor on the wind turned her stomach. Sweet and rotten, like meat left too long in summer sun, mixed with wood smoke and something else she couldn't identify. The Combs cabin came into view as she rounded the final bend. A sagging structure, its wooden walls blackened by age and weather, its roof patched with rusted tin and what appeared to be animal hides. Chickens scattered across the yard, pecking at dirt between piles of refuse accumulated over years of neglect. And there, sitting on the porch in a rocking chair that creaked with each movement, sat Mabel Combs. Eleanor Whitfield would later write in her official report that her first sight of Mabel was the most disturbing thing she'd ever witnessed professionally. She would also note that this initial encounter marked only the beginning of a horror that would haunt her for the rest of her days. What Eleanor couldn't know as she stood frozen on that mountain path was that she was about to uncover a family secret hidden in these mountains for over a century. She was about to discover what happens when isolation, tradition, and biology combine to create something that defies all natural order. She was about to meet the woman who gave birth to death. Check right now if you're subscribed to this channel, because what you're about to witness in the next chapter is something most documentaries refuse to show. If you want to understand the darkest corners of human history, the secrets families bury in mountain graves, then you need to be here for every revelation. Subscribe now because this story is just beginning. Eleanor Whitfield forced herself forward, one step and then another. Her training had prepared her for poverty, for ignorance, for the desperate conditions plaguing so many Appalachian families during the Depression. But nothing in her Berea College education had prepared her for this. As she approached the porch, the smell grew stronger, and now she could see its source. Mabel Combs sat in her rocking chair, a woman appearing ancient yet unable to be more than 36 years old. Her face was gaunt, skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too prominent. But her arms drew Eleanor's horrified attention. From the elbows down, Mabel's arms were covered in what appeared to be bandages made from torn bed sheets. But those bandages were stained with dark fluids that had seeped through the fabric, creating patterns of brown and yellow and black. From beneath those wrappings emanated the smell of flesh no longer alive but not yet fully surrendered to decay. "Good afternoon," Eleanor managed, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to maintain professional composure. "I'm from the Kentucky Department of Welfare. I'm here to see if your family needs any assistance." Mabel's eyes, those pale gray orbs that seemed to look through rather than at the young social worker, fixed on Eleanor with an expression containing no surprise, no fear, only weary resignation. "Ain't nobody from the government ever come up here before," Mabel said, her voice a rasp suggesting years of disuse. Her words carried the thick mountain accent, dropped consonants, and elongated vowels of Appalachian English. "Reckon you're the first." Eleanor climbed the 3 porch steps, each creak of rotting wood making her flinch. Up close, she could see more details her initial shock had obscured. Mabel's dress was clean but patched so many times that identifying the original garment was impossible. Her hair, gray despite her youth, was pulled back in a tight bun. And her feet, Eleanor noticed with another wave of nausea, were bare, revealing toes fused together much like her fingers. "May I sit down?" Eleanor asked, gesturing to a 3-legged stool near the cabin door. Mabel nodded slowly, the rocking chair continuing its rhythm. "Reckon you can. Ain't had a visitor in a long time. Last one was the preacher man, and that was near 2 years back." Eleanor sat, pulling her notebook from her bag with hands she couldn't keep from shaking. "Mrs. Combs, I need to ask you some questions about your family, about your living situation." "Just Mabel," the woman said. "Ain't nobody called me Mrs. Combs since my wedding day." Over the next hour, Eleanor conducted an interview that would later become part of official Kentucky state records, documents eventually sealed for 50 years due to their disturbing content. She learned that Mabel lived in the cabin with her husband Jeremiah, their 3 surviving children, and 2 of Jeremiah's elderly unmarried sisters. She learned the family survived on what they could grow in a small garden, supplemented by hunting and occasional charity from distant neighbors who left supplies at the edge of their property, unwilling to approach the cabin directly. She learned about the 11 graves on the hillside. "Show me," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not a request she wanted to make, but duty required documentation. Mabel rose from her rocking chair with difficulty, her short leg causing her to lurch sideways before catching her balance. She led Eleanor around the cabin, past a smokehouse collapsed in on itself, past an outhouse leaning at an alarming angle, to a clearing on the mountain slope. The graves formed 2 rows, 11 total, each marked by a wooden cross. Some crosses had fallen, weathered by years of mountain storms. Others still stood, their arms reaching toward a sky that seemed perpetually gray in this isolated hollow. "This one's Samuel," Mabel said, pointing to the first grave. Her voice had taken on a distant quality, as if she were reciting a list rather than remembering dead children. "Born 1914, died 1914. This one's Mary, 1916. Never gave her a proper name before she passed. Just called her baby girl." She walked down the row naming each grave. "Thomas, 1917. Infant Combs, 1918. Rebecca, 1919. Another unnamed baby, 1921. Joseph, 1922. 2 more in 1924, twins who had died within hours of each other. Another in 1926, and the most recent, a boy named Daniel, who had died in 1930 at age 2 from what Mabel described as fits that made him shake until he stopped breathing. 11 babies, Eleanor said, her notebook forgotten in trembling hands. "You've buried 11 children." Mabel turned to face the young social worker. For the first time, Eleanor saw something other than resignation in those pale eyes. She saw a pain so deep, so profound, that it seemed to have carved itself into the very structure of Mabel's face. "I've birthed 14, Mabel said. Buried 11. Got 3 still living, though. Ruth, she ain't doing so well lately. Her back's gotten so curved she can barely stand no more." Eleanor wanted to ask more questions, but her voice had abandoned her. Instead, she followed Mabel back to the cabin where she would meet the rest of the family and document conditions that would shock administrators in Frankfurt when her report finally reached them. Inside the cabin, the smell was overwhelming. A combination of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, animal waste from chickens wandering freely through the single room, and something else. Something Eleanor now understood was the smell of Mabel's decaying flesh. The cabin was a single room, perhaps 20 by 30 feet, with a fireplace at one end and a collection of straw mattresses at the other. No furniture except a rough-hewn table and 2 benches. A ladder led to a loft where, Mabel explained, the children slept. Jeremiah Combs sat at the table, a man appearing to be in his 70s but actually 58 years old. His face was weather-beaten, lined with wrinkles speaking of a lifetime of hard labor and harder living. Like Mabel, he bore the physical marks of his family's genetic isolation. His jaw was misaligned, causing his face to appear lopsided. His hands, resting on the table before him, were large and calloused, but the fingers were crooked, bent at angles suggesting joints that had never formed correctly. "This here's my husband," Mabel said. "Jeremiah, you don't talk much to strangers." Jeremiah's eyes, dark and suspicious, fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that made her want to flee. But she held her ground, introduced herself, and asked if she could see the children. The 2 elderly sisters, Hester and Beulah, emerged from the shadows at the back of the cabin. Both in their 60s, their faces so similar that Eleanor initially thought she was seeing double. Both women had the same underdeveloped jaw as Mabel, the same wide-set eyes. They moved in unison, their bodies bent with age and the weight of a lifetime spent in this isolated hollow. "The children are in the loft," Hester said, her voice a thin reed of sound. "Elias won't come down for strangers. He's scared of new faces. Ruth's too sick to move today. Martha might come down if you call her sweet." Eleanor spent the rest of the afternoon documenting the Combs family's living conditions. She noted the lack of sanitation, the inadequate food supplies, the absence of any medical care. She photographed the cabin with a small camera she'd brought for just such purposes, though the images would later be described as too disturbing for public release. But her final observation of the day would prove most consequential. As she prepared to leave, dreading the long walk back to where her guide waited, Eleanor noticed Mabel struggling to change the bandages on her arms. The old bandages had fallen away, revealing what lay beneath. Eleanor Whitfield had seen wounds before. She'd visited hospitals, witnessed the aftermath of mining accidents, viewed bodies at funerals. But she'd never seen anything like this. Mabel's arms, from elbows to wrists, were covered in open sores weeping a dark, viscous fluid. The skin around the sores was black and leathery, clearly dead tissue that had never been removed. In some places, the damage ran so deep that Eleanor could see the white of bone beneath. "It's been like this for years now," Mabel said, noticing Eleanor's horrified stare. "Started small, just a patch here and there. Now it's spreading. Got it on my legs, too, on my belly. Jeremiah says it's God's punishment for something I've done. But I don't know what I'd done that was so bad." Eleanor's medical knowledge was limited, but she understood that Mabel needed immediate hospital care. The infection, if that's what it was, would eventually kill her untreated. But she also understood that convincing this isolated family to accept outside help would be nearly impossible. "Mabel," she said carefully, "you need to see a doctor. What you have, it's serious. It could be treated in a hospital." Mabel's laugh was bitter, a sound scraping against the cabin walls. "Ain't no hospital going to take me. Look at me. Look at my face, my hands, my feet. They'd think I was some kind of monster. And maybe I am. Maybe that's what happens when you're born the way I was born." When you have babies the way I have babies." She paused, her pale eyes meeting Eleanor's with a directness that was almost painful. "You want to know the truth about this family, Miss Eleanor? You want to know why I look the way I look? Why my babies die? Why my body's rotting while I'm still breathing?" Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. "My mama was my daddy's sister. My daddy was my grandma's son and also her nephew because his daddy was his mama's brother, too. Go back far enough and we're all the same person over and over again. We've been marrying each other in this hollow for so long that we've forgotten how to make babies that live." She held up her bandaged arms, the dark stain spreading across the white cloth. "And this is what happens when the blood gets too thick. This is what happens when God decides you've been making the same person too many times." Eleanor Whitfield left Creek Hollow that evening with a report that would eventually reach the governor of Kentucky. But by the time authorities decided to act on her findings, it would be too late for Mabel Combs. Because in the remote hollows of Appalachia in the year 1931, the outside world moved slowly and death moved much faster. 3 weeks passed before Eleanor Whitfield's report generated any official response. In Frankfort, Kentucky's capital, bureaucrats read her findings with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Some suggested the young social worker had exaggerated conditions for dramatic effect. Others wondered if she'd been victim to an elaborate hoax perpetrated by mountain people known to be suspicious of government interference. But the photographs couldn't be dismissed. The images of the Combs cabin, of the graves on the hillside, of Mabel's bandaged arms, were too visceral, too disturbing to ignore. On October 15, 1931, a decision was made. The Kentucky Department of Health would send a physician to Creek Hollow to conduct a medical evaluation of the Combs family. The doctor selected was a young man named Dr. Harrison Cole, a University of Louisville Medical School graduate assigned to rural health outreach in Harlan County. Dr. Cole was 32, idealistic, and utterly unprepared for what he was about to encounter. He arrived in Harlan on October 18, 1931, and spent 2 days trying to find a guide willing to take him to the Combs property. Most local men he approached refused outright, offering vague explanations about the hollow being cursed or the family being touched by something unnatural. Finally, an elderly miner named Oscar Hensley agreed to lead Dr. Cole to the edge of Creek Hollow, but no further. "I'll take you to where the path splits," Oscar said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "After that, you're on your own. I ain't set foot near that cabin since I was a boy, and I ain't about to start now." "What happened when you were a boy?" Dr. Cole asked, curious about the obvious fear surrounding any mention of the Combs family. Oscar was silent for a long moment before answering. "Saw something I shouldn't have seen. A baby being born that wasn't right. What came out of that woman had too many arms, not enough face. They buried it before sunset, same as all the others." Dr. Cole arrived at the Combs cabin on the morning of October 21, 1931. Unlike Eleanor Whitfield, he'd been warned about the smell, and he'd prepared by applying mentholate salve beneath his nose. But no amount of preparation could have readied him for the sight of Mabel Combs in the advanced stages of her deterioration. In the 3 weeks since Eleanor's visit, Mabel's condition had worsened dramatically. The dead tissue had spread from her arms to her shoulders, and new patches had appeared on her neck and face. She could no longer walk without assistance, as her legs had begun showing the same decay. She spent her days in the rocking chair on the porch, wrapped in blankets despite the autumn chill, waiting for a death that seemed determined to take its time. Dr. Cole conducted the most thorough examination conditions would allow. He documented the extent of Mabel's tissue death, noting it appeared to be a form of dry gangrene complicated by what he suspected was severe circulatory disorder. He examined her surviving children, noting their physical abnormalities and attempting to assess their overall health. Elias, the eldest at 11, wouldn't allow Dr. Cole to touch him. He cowered in the corner of the cabin, making sounds more animal than human, his eyes wide with terror at this stranger's presence. Ruth, 8, lay on a straw mattress, her curved spine now so severe she couldn't sit upright. Dr. Cole estimated she had perhaps a year before the deformity compressed her lungs to the point where breathing became impossible. Martha, the youngest at 4, was the only one appearing relatively healthy. She approached Dr. Cole with curiosity, her small hand reaching out to touch his medical bag. But even she showed signs of the family's genetic burden. Her heartbeat was irregular, skipping beats in a pattern Dr. Cole had only seen in elderly patients with severe cardiac disease. But his conversation with Mabel would later become the most important record of the Combs family's history. "I need to understand your family tree," Dr. Cole said, sitting across from Mabel in the cabin's dim interior. "I need to know who married whom, going back as far as you can remember." Mabel's response was slow, her voice weakened by illness, but her memory proved remarkably sharp. Over 2 hours, she recounted the history of the Combs family in Creek Hollow, a tale of isolation and intermarriage stretching back to the early 1800s. The first Combs to settle the hollow was a man named Josiah, who'd arrived in 1793, fleeing something or someone in Virginia. He'd brought a wife, Sarah, and 2 daughters. When those daughters came of age, they married travelers passing through, and for a few generations, the bloodline remained relatively diverse. But the Civil War changed everything. During the conflict, Creek Hollow became a hiding place for men wanting no part in the fighting. These men, mostly Combs descendants, remained in the hollow after the war, unwilling to return to a world torn apart by violence. With no outside contact and no new blood entering the community, they began marrying each other. By 1880, no Combs in the hollow existed who wasn't related to every other Combs. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. In at least 2 cases Mabel knew of, brothers had married sisters. "My grandma used to say we were keeping the blood pure," Mabel told Dr. Cole, a bitter smile twisting her damaged face. "Said that mixing with outsiders would weaken us, make us like the soft people in the cities. But I think we made ourselves weaker instead. I think we made ourselves sick in ways that can't be fixed." Dr. Cole asked about the stillbirths, the infant deaths, the graves on the hillside. Mabel recounted each with a mother's precision, describing the abnormalities that had marked every child. Babies born without skulls. Babies born with organs outside their bodies. Babies born with limbs ending in stumps or fingers numbering more than 10. Babies born with faces that seemed to have melted, features sliding together in ways making them unrecognizable as human. "The ones that live are the ones that look almost right," Mabel said. "Elias, Ruth, Martha, they've got problems, but they look like people. The others, the ones in the ground, they looked like something went wrong when God was making them. Like he got confused halfway through." Dr. Cole's report recommended immediate intervention. He urged the state to remove the surviving children from the hollow and place them in institutions where they could receive proper medical care. He recommended Mabel be transported to a Lexington hospital where specialists might slow her condition's progression. But the wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly in 1931. The Great Depression had stripped Kentucky of resources, and the remote hollows of Harlan County weren't a priority. Letters were written, filed, lost, and rewritten. Meetings were scheduled and postponed. By the time any official decision was made, winter had descended upon Creek Hollow with a ferocity making travel impossible. The winter of 1931 to 1932 was one of the harshest on record in Appalachian Kentucky. Snow began falling in early November and didn't stop until late February. Temperatures dropped so low that the creek giving the hollow its name froze solid for the first time in living memory. Inside the Combs cabin, the family huddled around the fireplace, burning every piece of wood they could find. Jeremiah, despite his age and physical limitations, made daily trips into the forest to gather fuel, returning with bundles of branches often too wet to burn properly. The cabin filled with smoke that made breathing difficult, especially for Ruth, whose compressed lungs struggled with each intake of air. Mabel's condition continued deteriorating. By December, the gangrene had spread to cover most of her body. She could no longer leave her bed, a straw mattress near the fireplace where she lay wrapped in every blanket the family possessed. The smell of her decaying flesh had become so overwhelming that even her own children avoided coming near her. But during this terrible winter, Mabel Combs revealed a secret she'd kept hidden for over a decade. On the night of January 15, 1932, as a blizzard howled outside and the family sat in darkness to conserve their meager candle supply, Mabel called her husband to her bedside. "There's something I never told you," she whispered, her voice so weak Jeremiah had to lean close to hear. Something about the babies, about why so many of them died. What Mabel confessed that night would never appear in any official record. It passed down only through family whispers and the reluctant testimony of those living in surrounding hollows. But the truth she revealed was this: Mabel had known even before her marriage that bearing children with her uncle would produce offspring unlikely to survive. Her own mother had warned her before the wedding that the Combs bloodline was cursed, not by God or any supernatural force, but by the simple accumulation of weakness upon weakness, generation after generation. Her mother had buried 8 children of her own and had watched her sisters bury even more. "She told me not to have babies," Mabel whispered to Jeremiah. "She told me to find a way to prevent it, to take herbs, to do whatever I had to do. But you wanted children. Your sisters wanted children in this house, and I was too scared to say no." Jeremiah's response to this confession wasn't recorded. But witnesses would later report that in the days following that night, the old man seemed to have aged another decade. He stopped speaking almost entirely, communicating only in grunts and gestures. Some said he'd been broken by guilt. Others said he simply had nothing left to say. On February 3, 1932, Ruth Combs died in her sleep. She was 8 years old. Her curved spine had finally compressed her lungs to the point where they could no longer function. They buried her on the hillside in frozen ground next to her 11 siblings. The grave was the 12th in the row. Mabel was too ill to attend the burial. She lay in the cabin listening to the sound of Jeremiah's pickaxe breaking through frozen earth, knowing her daughter was joining the others in that cold ground. 3 weeks later, on February 27, 1932, Mabel Combs drew her final breath. She was 36 years old. She'd been married for 19 years. She'd given birth 14 times. Only 2 of her children, Elias and Martha, survived her. They buried her on the hillside in a grave larger than the others at the row's end. The wooden cross marking her resting place was carved by Jeremiah himself, who had found enough strength in his grief to create something lasting for the woman who had shared his life and his blood. The inscription on that cross, according to those who saw it before time and weather erased the words, read simply, "Mabel Combs, wife, mother, forgiven." The story of Mabel Combs might have ended there, buried on a hillside in an isolated Kentucky hollow, forgotten by a world that never knew she existed. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. In spring 1932, when the snows finally melted and the paths became passable again, Eleanor Whitfield returned to Creek Hollow. She'd never stopped thinking about the family she'd discovered there. When she learned of Mabel's death through the slow channels of mountain communication, she felt compelled to see what had become of the survivors. What she found was a hollow in its final stages of decay. Jeremiah Combs had died just 2 weeks after his wife, succumbing to pneumonia his weakened body couldn't fight. The 2 elderly sisters, Hester and Beulah, had followed him within days of each other, their bodies simply giving up after a lifetime of deprivation. Only Elias and Martha remained, 2 children alone in a cabin filled with death. Eleanor immediately contacted authorities in Frankfort. This time, the response was swift. On April 15, 1932, a team from the Kentucky Department of Welfare arrived in Creek Hollow to remove the children and document the scene. The photographs taken that day would remain sealed in state archives for 50 years. They showed the cabin as it had been left, the straw mattresses still bearing impressions of bodies that had lain there, the fireplace cold and empty, the table still set for a meal never eaten. They showed the hillside cemetery, 13 graves now, a family reduced to wooden crosses and memories. Elias was placed in the Kentucky State Institution for the Feeble-Minded in Frankfort, where he would spend the rest of his life. Records indicate he never learned to speak beyond a few basic words and spent his days in quiet withdrawal, rarely interacting with staff or other residents. He died in 1958 at age 38 of heart failure related to the same genetic defects plaguing his family for generations. Martha's fate was different and, in some ways, more hopeful. She was placed with a foster family in Lexington, far from the mountains that had defined her early childhood. The family, a childless couple named the Hendersons, gave her a new name, a new life, and access to medical care her biological family could never have provided. Her heart condition was treated as much as the medicine of the time allowed. She attended school, learned to read and write, and grew into a young woman bearing few visible signs of her origins. In 1945, at 22, she married a veteran named Robert Turner and moved with him to Ohio, where she would live for the next 6 decades. Martha never spoke of Creek Hollow. She never told her husband about her birth family, her mother's decaying body, or the 12 graves on the hillside. She created a new history for herself, one beginning with her placement in foster care and erasing everything that came before. But in 1987, at 64, Martha received a letter forcing her to confront the past she'd spent a lifetime avoiding. The letter came from a University of Kentucky researcher, a geneticist named Dr. Patricia Owens, who had discovered the sealed records of the Combs family while investigating genetic disorder history in Appalachian communities. Dr. Owens had managed to trace Martha's path from Creek Hollow to her current Columbus, Ohio home, and she was requesting an interview. Martha's initial response was refusal. She'd built a life on forgetting and had no desire to remember. But something in Dr. Owens's letter touched a nerve Martha believed dead. The researcher wrote about the importance of understanding families like the Combses, not to judge them, but to learn from their tragedy. She wrote about how Appalachian communities' isolation and poverty had created conditions allowing consanguinity to flourish, and how understanding this history could help prevent similar tragedies in the future. After weeks of consideration, Martha agreed to meet with Dr. Owens. The interview took place over 3 days in September 1987. Martha, now a gray-haired grandmother with 3 children and 7 grandchildren, recounted her memories of Creek Hollow for the first time in over 50 years. She spoke of her mother, the woman whose body rotted while she still lived. She spoke of her siblings, the survivors, and the ones who hadn't made it. She spoke of the cabin's smell, the winter's cold, the sound of her father digging graves in frozen ground. And she spoke of the legacy she'd carried with her, hidden but never truly forgotten. "I never had my children tested," Martha told Dr. Owens, her voice trembling with an emotion suppressed for decades. "Was too afraid of what they might find. Too afraid that I'd passed on whatever was wrong with my family. But they all turned out healthy, normal, like the curse skipped a generation." Modern genetics would later explain what Martha described as a curse. The genetic abnormalities plaguing the Combs family resulted from recessive genes, mutations manifesting only when inherited from both parents. By marrying outside the family, Martha had broken the cycle. Her children inherited only one copy of the defective genes, not enough to cause the devastating effects that had killed her siblings. Dr. Owens's research, published in 1990, would become one of the most comprehensive studies of consanguinity in American history. It documented the Combs family across 7 generations, tracing the marriage and birth patterns that had led to Mabel and her 14 children. It explained in scientific terms how isolation and tradition had combined to create genetic catastrophe. But for Martha, the research meant something more personal. It meant her mother's suffering hadn't been in vain. It meant the story of Creek Hollow wouldn't be forgotten. Martha Turner died in 2003 at age 80, surrounded by the family she'd created. Her children and grandchildren, healthy and whole, knew nothing of their heritage until after her death, when they discovered a box of letters and photographs she'd kept hidden in her closet for decades. Among those photographs was a single image of Mabel Combs taken by Eleanor Whitfield in September 1931. It showed a woman sitting in a rocking chair, her bandaged arms crossed over her chest, her pale eyes staring directly at the camera. On the back of the photograph in Martha's handwriting were the words, "My mother, the woman who gave birth to death." And to this day, Creek Hollow no longer exists as a community. The cabins have collapsed into the forest floor, reclaimed by the mountains sheltering the Combs family for over a century. The graves on the hillside are unmarked now, the wooden crosses long since rotted away. Only the land remembers what happened there, and land keeps its secrets well. But the story of Mabel Combs lives on, a reminder of what happens when isolation, tradition, and biology collide. It is a story of suffering, yes, but also of survival. Of a woman enduring unimaginable pain, and of a daughter escaping to build a different future. The woman who gave birth to death also gave birth to life. And that life continues to this day in Martha Turner's descendants, carrying within them the genetic memory of Creek Hollow, diluted and dormant, but never entirely erased. Some secrets are buried in mountain graves. Others are carried in blood. And some stories, no matter how painful, must be told so we never forget the human cost of isolation, ignorance, and the terrible weight of tradition. If you watched until the end, it's because this story touched something deep within you. Leave a comment right now saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know who you are and recognize those who truly appreciate the stories here on this channel. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the hidden tragedies existing in history's forgotten corners, then please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. These stories deserve to be remembered, and you can help make that happen. And if you're not yet subscribed to this channel, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because more stories are waiting to be told, more secrets waiting to be revealed, more voices from the past waiting to be heard. Subscribe and become part of a community refusing to let these forgotten lives remain forgotten. Until next.